Thank you very much, Robin. Before I begin, Saint Innocent is known as the Apostle to America and the Enlightener. We also have Innocentia, who's now the new Enlightener of Fort Ross. I'm Father John Perich, the curator of the Museum and Repository of the Orthodox Church in America. When we started the repository over 40 years now, we initially had 3 pieces in the museum. Over the last 40 years, we have collected a tremendous number, now probably numbering over 10,000 pieces, which were through the generosity of priest families over the last 150 years and lay people whose parents or grandparents were clergymen. So therefore, the museum came from nothing into something. We're going to hopefully, in the next few years, build a museum in Alaska, in the Anchorage area, hopefully if I live that long, because I just retired after 47 years. But my desire is to build a museum in Alaska for not only the Orthodox, but for those that come to Alaska on these trips, because this way they'll be able to understand the Orthodox faith that was brought to America by St. Herman and the members of the Valam mission. So, I brought some items which I think are important for you to understand. As I was listening to this whole conference, many names were brought up that I was especially familiar with, like Father Theodore Pashkovsky, later Metropolitan Theophilus. You know, they talked about his family, the Pashkovsky family, but probably very seldom or very rare do you know that his one son Boris became Colonel Boris Pash and started the Manhattan Project. So that's a very important thing, that it all came from clergy families. St. Tikhon was also very active in Alaska, San Francisco, Chicago, and in New York. It's amazing that in those days, turn of the century, priests and bishops traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast to Alaska so easily, and yet we take a flight from Philadelphia and I'm in jet lag probably for the next 2 more days. But I think it's important that we understand that all these names that were brought out today, all are connected because of our Orthodox faith. So Alaska is connected to Fort Ross to the rest of the country. Metropolitan Theophilus was our hierarch of the Orthodox Church in America under the Mitropolia. Tikhon was the bishop of the Aleutian Islands, Mitropolia. All these hierarchs were part of the church that we have and inherited now in America. To begin, I brought the original antimins from the Valam mission that was in the hands of someone who was from San Francisco. The great nephew of Saint Innocent was born in San Francisco in the 1860s and eventually became a priest. His name was Father Alexander Veniaminov, and he was a priest here in San Francisco and eventually ended up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he was a priest since 1914 till he died. He was in charge of keeping this antimins from Alaska, and I remember when I was a priest in Bridgeport 40-some years ago, this antimins was folded under the gospel. And we were instructed by everybody in the church and in the diocese and the national church never to touch this from the gospel or remove it, that it would always stay there under the gospel with the antimins that was given by the bishop at that time. So this is how this antimins was preserved all these years. And this is where the first liturgies would have been celebrated in Alaska, and especially in Kodiak. Okay, you can put there. The next piece, not so related to this piece, but important for the church, is the Petrahiel of St. Seraphim of Sarovsk. In 1945, a delegation of priests came from the United States to Russia to attend the Sobor to elect the new Patriarch of Moscow. What happened was they missed the Sobor by most 3 or 4 months. For some reason or other, and there's a lot of speculation as to why, when they arrived, they were taken around all over and arrived too late to attend the Sobor, which had already concluded, so they could vote at the Sobor for the new Patriarch. That was Father Joseph Zvonchik. And instead, he was sent to Diveyevo, where the nuns at the monastery gave him this Petrahiel and said, please take this out of the country and someday bring it back to us, but keep it for safekeeping. So this is the Petrahiel that he brought to the United States in 1945. We were talking, one of the speakers was speaking about a trip that was made by the great-great-great-great-grandson of Innocenti. And it was in, I think, in the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. And Metropolitan Theodosius was the head of the church here in America, and he traveled with this great-great-great-grandson. And what he did was he presented him with a full collection of hand watercolors that he made himself. Some of the church where Innocenti was buried, some of the watercolors of his ancestors, as well as others. So we have all of those that he made at the repository of St. Tikhon's. I think they number about 9 or 10 pieces that he handed. Not only that, he gave us a collection of pictures of all his ancestors to the time of Innocenti, which we have at the museum, and it shows each generation. I mean, there must be 5 or 6 generations, maybe more, of even baby pictures that he wanted us to have to know that how they're all connected. So that is that. As far as this belt was made by the Kashaya Poma Indians here in Fort Ross. It was made in the tannery of Fort Ross, and the motif on the belt, which was made especially as a gift to St. Herman of Alaska, is acorns. Evidently, that's the motif of the native people here, the Kashaya people in this area. And I had some Kashaya people look at it, to examine it, to see the motif. And it actually tells a story from the first part of the belt to the end. It looks like it was an arrival, ocean, and then it transcends all the way down to little acorns going to a large acorn, meaning this area, because this is originally what I think it's called Metini or something, and it was the Kashaya area, who are a group from the Pomo larger group of Native Americans. And you know, during the time of the Fort Ross and the Russian Pomyshleniki and everything, we have to understand that Pomo Kashaya people were treated very well and equally. It's a known fact that the Kashaya people received even a salary at a time when the Russians treated the other native Indians in this area much differently. The Kashaya were somehow melded with the Russian community, a very close relationship. And that was beautiful, because if you remember when Innocenti came here as a priest in 1836, the church had not been consecrated there were so many baptisms and marriages and funerals and panihidas to perform that they all partook in those services. In fact, there's a picture which I'm going to give as gifts later of the actual Kresny Hod, the procession from the church to go around when you consecrate a church. So it's important to know that there was a very close relationship here of the Native Americans, just like in Alaska. You know, in Alaska, the Russian company did not exactly treat the natives well, but it was the Church of Alaska, St. Herman, and the other missionaries who basically interceded to the Russian American company for the help and the care of the Native Americans. If it wasn't for those missionaries from the Bala mission, the Makari and Juvenali and all these to intercede, the natives in Alaska would have been terribly mistreated. This is why after 200 years, more than 200 years, many years of which there were no priests in Alaska, that the Native Americans in Alaska have remained steadfast in their Orthodox faith and their loyalty and love to the church. In our repository, you know there's stories about St. Innocent and with the natives and how he had to sort of educate them. And he had to confront the shamans. The shamans were all over Alaska, especially amongst the Athabascan Indians. And you know the story about the shaman who confronted Innocentia, and the end of the situation was that he became an Orthodox Christian. And as his gift to Innocentia, he gave him his shaman stick. It's like a witch doctor. So he gave it to him, and then they put a cross on it. So we have that at the monastery. So anybody wants to see the original shaman stick, we have it. A lot of items that you see here have come to us over the years, like I said. We in the Orthodox Church here in America have sometimes neglected our historical inheritance. Sometimes things are discarded in churches that we'll never see again. That's the shame of it. We need more people like Innocentia who sort of enlightens us to the importance of our historical past. It's not just our historical past, it's our spirituality for the future. And we have to understand that it's so important for us to be able to attend these conferences not as spectators, not like we're performing in front of you, but we're sharing our hearts, the hearts of those who came before us, with your hearts. So that's so important. Here you have the original cross of Saint Innocentia, made from mammal bone. Now, when Innocentia came to see all these items, she insisted that we make copies to give to Vladika in Irkutsk, Maximilian, and to others in Anga. So this is the original. Everything we send to Anga is a copy. So I said, sometimes the copies are just as good as the original, so I'm very careful when I put them out that the things don't get switched over here. This here is the icon, and I'm running through all things so you know. This is the icon of the Belavin family. Who knows anything about what the name Belavin means? Yes? St. Tikhon was a Belavin, but there was more than one Belavin in America. He had a great-great-nephew who was a priest, and Nicholas Belavin, who died at the monastery. And this is the Belavin family icon that would have been St. Tikhon's family icon from his section of Russia. It's, you could see that with this Vishati and the pearls, it had to be made at a convent, a woman's monastery. Okay. Next, St. Tikhon was interred in the small cathedral, Mali Sobor, in Donskoy Monastery. And if you remember the story, when just after Perestroika, the church in Russia was going to make him a saint, and of course there was what looked like a marble grave, but as time went on, they found that he wasn't there. He was actually under the floor just before you got to that grave. And they had to lift up the floor in order to retrieve his body. This here is a piece of his casket from underneath the marble, and this is one of his heirs that was placed inside his casket. Next is something related to Fort Ross. This is the Petrahil that was used here in Fort Ross when Father John Veniaminov came here to serve in 1836. This is all we have. We had one cuff, but the other cuff we gifted to the church in Russia. But this is his Petrahil from that period of time. We don't have the Felon. Probably the Felon went with one priest, God knows where, or even in his casket with someone. Next you have the Gospel of St. Matthew, which was, translated by St. Innocent using the Slavonic alphabet for the Fox Island Aleut dialect, which was, of course, the farthest part of the Aleutian chain. And inside, there are several languages. There's the Slavonic version, the Russian alphabet version, and the Slavonic version of the Fox Island Aleut wording. So this is all based upon not the Russian alphabet, but the Slavonic alphabet. So it's very interesting. But this is the original with the Nachala in the front, written by Saint Innocent in order to be able to find and locate within the Evangelia the words or the section to have a sermon, a propagate. So this is the original. Now what's interesting is the actual book was written and sort of okayed by St. Jacob Nesvetov, who was from the Eskimo Yupik area of Alaska. Just to give you a little heads up, I'm going to Alaska in November. We've been trying to locate the actual grave of St. Jacob Nesvetov, which is in Sitka, in that cemetery that someone talked about. There's also the last governor of Alaska's wife, who's buried there, Aglaida, who was a Finnish woman. She did not convert to Orthodoxy. She was Prince Maksutov's wife, but she was from Finland area, so she remained a Lutheran. But what's interesting, all the miters and the gospel covers and the airs were all hand embroidered by her because she loved St. Innocent so much. So in Sitka, we have his mitra and other pieces all hand sewn by her. The great, 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 great grandson of this family is in New Jersey. I don't know if you ever heard of a choir director of all the choirs in that New York, New Jersey area named Shapovalnikov. Shapovalnikov is from that family, okay? Next is the chalice of St. Innocent. There's a tremendous story about this. It was gifted to St. Vladimir's Seminary years ago. And it was given by Metropolitan Theodosius, and it was placed in a cabinet in the side vestry room. In that period of time, both St. Tikhon's and St. Vladimir's, there was a robbery that occurred in both places within a week or 2 weeks apart. All gospels, all beautiful pieces that were gifted to these places were taken. This chalice was found by the Yonkers Police Department in a field, broken, just cracked. So it had to be resoldered. but at least it was retrieved. Other Gospels were eventually found, and now we're in possession, most likely, probably about 25, 26 of the original Gospels, including the one from Catherine the Great, at the repository. But you see how careful we have to be with our artifacts, because we didn't even know we had them 40 or 50 years ago, but now that we have them, we have to care for them. I like that. That's like a, is Robin running that thing? This is a Zion cup from Innocenti, dated and everything, and on the bottom, the pechat and everything is listed here. And this Panagia is St. Innocenti's. Some of the stones, to say the least, are missing, but it's his Panagia. And no, Robin, I can't make a copy of this. It's impossible. But that's the original. Next, you have an icon. This is Siberian topaz. It was in Alaska in a church outside of Anchorage called Eklutna, where they have little houses on the graves, And this is one of the originals. Next, I brought, just for your sake here, because I know there's a lot of Serbs in this area, I brought the Amaphor of St. Nikolai of Zhicha, who died at St. Tikhon's Monastery, and his Kalainik, who was a half Russian and half Serbian also, his name was Father Kirill Bulashevich. He ended up in Juneau for many years. But this is the original of the Amaphor, small Amaphor, of St. Nikolai of Zhicha. By the way, Sebastian Dabovich, St. Sebastian, I have his cross at the museum, and people don't realize he was not just in San Francisco. He was born here, and he did marry Father Pashkovsky's. Father Pashkovsky married his niece. But he was also the professor at the Minneapolis Seminary and professor at the seminary in Tenafly, New Jersey. So his career was long. He also was a priest in Juneau for the Serbian community in Douglas, which is right across the way from Juneau. Next, you have the Panagia bone ivory of Innocenti. We made a copy of this to give to Vladika in Irkutsk. And here you have the mushrooms. The Slavic people, they baranahova, which means it's a ram's head, but this is not. Ram's head should grow at the bottom of an oak tree. So these are at the bottom of the Sitka spruce trees in Kodiak. So they're of different shape. And what the natives do is they take hot needles and they carve into the mushroom. And then it hardens, it solidifies. So this is from Kodiak, and that's a picture of the Kodiak Cathedral, Holy Resurrection. Here you have baskets, which of course the Native Americans are experts at. This is the weave made from seagrass or seaweed that's dried. And then they like almost crochet it into a pattern. But if you look at the details, look at how closely weaved that is. Now, the Atu baskets are very famous. A basket of this size, if you put it, for example, a price on it, even though they're priceless, these run between $20,000 and maybe $50,000 if there was an American that was able to get there before the natives to steal it. So it's true, there are many of them that have been taken and placed in museums. But to get to the museum, I hate to say this, but there was an intermediary who sold it to them. And that's how they get there. With a lot of church precious items, especially in Anchorage, at the bank there's a museum, and I think there must be at least 200 pieces from the churches in Alaska they have confiscated and placed in these museums. But this is not uncommon. After the Revolution and after the Civil War, you could buy icons in San Francisco, in Paris, in New York that belonged to families who smuggled them out in order to survive. And this is how they survived, with these artifacts. And many of them, thank God, eventually ended up in churches. And that's why there's churches here and everywhere else that have beautiful icons on their walls. It's so important for us to preserve them, but at least to have them back where they belong. This is Athabascan. Athabascans are the Indians that control the area all the way from Anchorage up to what we used to call Denali or Mount McKinley, coming down all the way to the Kenai Peninsula. And this is the artwork that they do with beads. Many of our missionaries, like Father Kashivarov, Shadura, all these priests from the early days in the 1890s, all were Creoles, mixed Russian with Aleutic or Aleut wives. Now remember, Peter the Aleut was not an Aleut. He was Aleutic. Aleutic language is directly related to Yupik, not to the Aleut. So it's a misnomer to say Peter the Aleut, but in Russia at that time, anybody from Alaska that was in this and that area was Aleuti. So therefore, that's why he has that Peter the Aleut. But if you ask an Aleutic person, they'll correct you. Now in 1977, Archbishop Gregory Afonsky, who was the Bishop of Alaska, had this urge to be able to write the canonization authorization to make Peter the Aleut and Juvenali the hieromonk saints of the church. And I'm sure Vladika would correct me, but I think I'm pretty accurate. There was a commission set up in Alaska. Vladika Gregory Afonsky, Father Nicholas Harris, Father Michael Alexa, and myself. I was the one that did all the writing and all the corrections. And we worked on this for 3 years. And of course, you know, to have a saint proclaimed nationally, the question was, how much veneration of St. Peter the Aleut existed in Alaska at that time. Now, it did exist because of the fact that Uzinki and the area of Old Harbor, because Kaguyak, where he came from, was destroyed. It was with a tidal wave, and it destroyed the village. But the people scattered. Some came to Kodiak, some went to Afagnak, some went to the other villages. But there were memories that we had to extricate from these older people. For example, the Malutin family. I had been talking to one who was 95 years old, and this back in 1977. And she recalled her family explaining about these stories about Peter, a man named Peter, who was killed in California. Of course, they didn't know all the details, but they knew he was one of theirs. And this is why we interviewed all of them, recorded everything on little cassettes to make sure we would have the information documented. After that, Vladika submitted the Prashchenia, the petition, to make him a saint in the Orthodox Church of America, but of course, it could not happen. Why? I don't know, but it didn't. So what we did, to go around it, we proclaimed him through Vladika Gregory, locally as the saint of Alaska. And this is why his canonization took place in Kodiak, and after that, it took up all over the country. It was September 24th, 1980, if I'm not mistaken. That was my ordination day. I was ordained on that feast day, and the first of the martyrs. But I was ordained in New York by Metropolitan Theodosius, and I turned to him during the service, because there were 3 bishops, and I said, who are we celebrating today? And they looked at me, and I said, today's the feast of St. Peter the Aleut and Juvenali the hieromonk. And they agreed. So we placed an icon in the middle of the church on that day. I was ordained in Yonkers Holy Trinity Church. And therefore, that took off. And if I'm not mistaken, churches started to be formed in America after their names, Peter the Aleut and Juvenali. So this is how a canonization can happen. As long as there's veneration, local veneration, this is the most important thing concerning canonization. Here you have some other items, Athabascan beadwork, and this is a panagia, the one here with the blue sapphires, that was made in Kodiak, and it was given to Vladika Gregory, and he would not wear it. He kept it special because he said someday this is a beautiful item that portrays the Alaska Natives' love for the church, because everything they do was handmade, hand-carved. But imagine, not having a priest for 7 or 8 years, how are you going to hold on to your faith? It was instilled in them through love, primarily, by the missionaries, by the priests who worked in Alaska, and by the bishops. So this is my presentation of some of our items. Okay? Thank you very much.